I chose to do a study on islands and how they were affected by the coronavirus, looking at both cases and number of deaths. The first screen here, you can see the islands that I chose to do, basically anything that our story here allowed me to do. And this is countries, islands that are countries. So Hawaii didn't make the list, Greenland didn't make the list. Every country that's an island is what I was able to do. So I wanted to look at islands specifically because I live on an island, but I live on an island in Alaska, down here, South Alaska, called Kodiak, and there is almost nothing to look at in Alaska. There was one confirmed case in Kodiak, 0 deaths, and then there were only 365 cases in Alaska when I looked at the data, and very few deaths. So there's not much to look at there, but I wanted to do something similar to that I had personal attachment to and would be a little different from everybody else. Looking at the number of cases in non-islands, this is everything except islands, so I can compare this to my results at the end. 73 million cases worldwide outside of islands. Then looking at the deaths for non-islands, 4,736,000. So my thinking is if you live on an island, you're more secluded, you're away from people more, it's a little hard to travel to. I generally think the population on islands is smaller than where there are cities. Typically on small islands, you would think that there'd be a whole lot less opportunity to get coronavirus. So here's looking at deaths on 9 island countries and cases by island countries. So looking at this data, United Kingdom is way over half of the data here. And scrolling through, I think that most of my theory is correct looking at other islands. So the next biggest one is Ireland at 20,000, which is part of United Kingdom. So the rest of these islands definitely fit my theory. There's very, very few cases in most of these. And then looking at deaths, even fewer in most cases. And then looking at United Kingdom again, 27,000 out of 29,500. So United Kingdom takes up a huge amount of the cases and deaths for coronavirus on islands. So here I made a donut pie chart looking at the percentage of islands that had cases of coronavirus versus non-islands. So 73 million cases total. Non-islands made up 94.5% of that. So to compare this to deaths, I would think that the deaths would take up more than 94.5%. So islands for cases is at 5.4%. I would think that for the grand total, islands would take up a smaller part. But I was very wrong in this. Islands take up 10.5% of the total deaths. And a big part of this is the United Kingdom's records. So looking back and forth at the two, islands 5.4 for cases, and islands 10.5 for deaths. So islands take up a much bigger chunk than I expected. I also looked at the population. I put together a chart to look at the population of islands versus non-islands. For all the populations, I added up the individual countries. So I looked those up and added all of them up, and then took the world population and just subtracted the total island population. I wanted to do this so I could compare what the islands were in population size, so you get a better idea of what we're looking at. I can use this to get an idea of what the island population is going to look like versus the cases. Is there a correlation between how many people live there and how many cases and deaths there are? And do the number of cases stay symmetrical to the population? And is there some kind of link there? So world population 7,594,000,000, islands at 427 million, non-islands at 7,167,000,000. So islands take up 5.62% of the world's population, which matches very close to the number of cases. So the number of cases and the population on islands is right there next to each other. They're extremely proportionate, 5.6 versus 5.4. So that matches, but then the deaths at 10.5, which I found very interesting. So I think the biggest thing going forward, if I was to investigate more, I'd want to know why United Kingdom has the biggest case and the most deaths. I'd want to investigate why that island in particular. Is the population bigger? Is there a whole lot more travel? Were they just in a more susceptible place? It's very, very clear that United Kingdom sticks out way, way more. If you took out United Kingdom of this story here, we'd have a completely different outlook on islands in the world versus the rest of the world. I think we would see that islands take up a very, very small portion of cases and deaths, next to 1% compared to the 10% we see with United Kingdom. Here in the summary page I made, I can compare cases by country, deaths by country, cases by island country versus deaths by island country, and then I put the donut charts at the bottom here for a quick comparison. So looking at the grand totals, it's pretty easy to see that the top countries kind of stay the same. US, China's not too far away, Italy, Spain, kind of there hand in hand. And then the same thing for islands, United Kingdom, very top of the list for both cases and deaths. And then there's not much change, Ireland. So there's a definite correlation between the number of cases and the number of deaths stays about the same. If a country has a high number of cases, they have a very high number of deaths too. That seems to be proportionate across islands as well. And then looking at the donuts side by side, you can get a better view of the number of deaths in islands versus the number of cases. It's still very big significance.